It's not, another way to put it is, it can't be a matter of God's free decision or whim what's right and wrong. People can see that morality is what it is. They know what they ought to do. But human beings are weak. We're weak. We have weakness of the will. We don't always do what we know very well we ought to do. And that is, in most people, produces the phenomenon of guilt. Guilt is a powerful negative force in people's minds. People hate guilt. Right? Guilt is a bad feeling. So you need something to prevent guilt. To prevent guilt, you need something to make you do what you know is right. But since human beings are weak, they don't always do what they know is right. But God gives you an extra motive to do what's right, beyond morality itself. Morality gives you a motive, but it's a motive which is rather fragile, rather, momentary, intermittent, and easily broken. But if you've got the idea of God there, it can sort of give it some more oomph, gives it more power. And then you can do what you know is right more easily, more regularly, and that's, perfectly sensible. That's why, it's reasonable, it's not unreasonable anyway for an atheist to think that maybe we need God, or people need God, because without God they can't do what they know is right. And I don't believe that myself. I think people are not as morally depraved as the religious tradition says. I think most people will do what's right in normal conditions. They won't always, of course, but normally they will. They don't need God. And I think people who sometimes have lived with God as their moral support, their moral whatever it is that they're getting from it, when they cease to believe in God, they feel that it was not as difficult to be moral afterwards as they suspected it might be. And in fact, it was better, because there's a corrupting part to that conception of God, which is the idea that you're doing something good because God will reward you and think well of you. And that's a corrupting idea. It's much better to do what's good because it's good, and only because it's good. And that's your only reason for doing it. But the idea you're going to get the warm, fuzzy feeling, oh, God's really pleased with me today, I did this, that's not what morality ought to be about.
Having discussed the various arguments that have been offered in favour of the existence of God, I asked Colin to summarise some of the best reasons for not believing.
Well, the classic argument against is the problem of evil. This is, even religious people find this one very uncomfortable. So the argument is simply God is meant to be a being who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. So how come there is suffering and pain in the world? Right? Why does God allow it? God, obviously, if he's all good, thinks it's bad that this should occur, would rather it didn't occur, right? Like any decent person would rather it didn't occur, and yet he lets it occur. Now, that would be okay if he didn't have the power to change it, but he's meant to be all-powerful. We're told by religious people he intervenes all the time in various ways. So why doesn't he intervene to prevent the death of a child, or the torture of a prisoner? He doesn't do it. So you don't want to conclude from that, well, God is actually quite bad, quite a bad person. That's a conceivable conclusion you might draw. But what you conclude from it is the combination of these two characteristics is inconsistent. He's all good and he's all powerful. You need all-knowing too, of course, because he has to know what's going on. But it's essentially the conflict between being all good and all powerful and the existence of evil. And the standard reply to that, the apologists of religion will give the reply, God created human beings with free will. Now, there's the question, why did he do that, knowing the results were going to be horrific? Right? That was a pretty wicked thing to do, to start with. But let's put that one aside. But the problem with that argument is not all of the suffering in the world comes from the exercise of human will. Much of it comes from natural catastrophes or disease, accidents, all sorts of things can cause tremendous suffering in humans. Somebody's born with a genetic disease. No human being had any role whatsoever in creating that. That comes from nature, God's creation, of course, we're told. So God created a world in which it was inevitable there'd be tremendous suffering on the part of completely innocent human beings.
But there might be religious arguments to the effect that he created this obstacle course for his created creatures endowed with free will in order to bring out the best in them.
And I always find this one, to me, it brings out to me the sort of hard-hearted, immoral side of this way of thinking about things. Because just think about what's being said when somebody says that. You've got the innocent child with some terrible disease, and God's up there saying to himself, I really need to test some people here. They need to put the obstacle course needs to be put there. Let me pick on this little 2-year-old girl put her through this terrible ordeal, and I'll test the other people. I mean, if any human being said to you that's what they'd done, suppose I decided, in my wisdom, I need to test some people here. I need to improve their moral characters. So I'm going to do this terrible thing to their child, you know. You'd think I was the wickedest person in the world to do that. Well, why isn't God? If that's what God does, I have no respect for him. I think that's a wicked thing to do. God shouldn't do that. If God cares about human beings, he should not allow that to happen.
Having discussed the arguments both for and against religion, we turned to speculation as to the reason why so many people still had a need to believe.
I don't think anybody has any very good ideas about why this is, especially why they believe in it to the extent that they do. What I would speculate about it is, I think it's less to do with the idea of death and survival of death and rewards in heaven and punishment in hell. I think it's a sort of cosmic loneliness. I think that's what's behind it. It's hard for people to accept that we are alone and that nobody cares outside of us. I think there's a kind of constitutive reason for that, which is human consciousness is essentially sealed off from other consciousnesses. Mine is sealed off from you. We only know each other indirectly through the symptoms of the body, and yet we yearn to be in contact with other people. Love is a lot to do with that. So we have this feeling that we are, as conscious embodied beings, somehow or other lonely in our essence, cut off in our essence. And that's a feeling which we struggle against. And you can see it in literature and so on, dealing with this theme. Frankenstein actually deals with it a lot. So we feel this sort of metaphysical, existential aloneness in the universe. And God is a wonderful antidote to that, because in the case of God, God, we feel, directly comes into our minds, and we're directly in contact with God. See, God doesn't know us through our bodies. God knows us intimately in our minds. And that satisfies a deep craving, I think, in the human soul, right, for communion with something outside the self.
I'd just like to finish with one thing. Here you are, like myself, reluctant to use the word atheist to describe what we are. It's an accusation rather than, as it were, a conviction. In a country which, in fact, has become more intensely religious, do you find it difficult to uphold such ideas in the America of the 21st century?
Let me say something about the first point, the label one has. Yeah, to be called an atheist, it's a negative view, and it suggests that one is a sort of professional atheist. You know, you spend your life arguing against God, which way Russell did. And I think that's a sort of an undignified and rather pointless procedure. Once you decide there isn't a God, you know, there's not much point in inveighing against it, unless you think huge harm is being done by the belief in God. But you don't, nobody spends their time trying to prove to others that the Greek gods don't exist. You know, you just decide that they don't, and that's the end of the story for you. So I like to distinguish atheism from anti-theism. Anti-theism is opposition to theism. I am an anti-theist because I believe that religion is harmful in human life. So I am an anti-theist. I'm not just an atheist who's something, my only values are that I don't agree with it. I'm actively opposed to it. But then I distinguish that from what I call post-theism or post-atheism, which is the healthy state of mind where you've put all that behind you. Now, we can't do that yet because there's lots of religion in the world and lots of bad results of it. But to me, the ideal society would be one in which the question of religion didn't really arise for people, or if it did, it wasn't a heavy question for them. They would say to each other, you know, those humans used to believe back there in 2003, some of them believed there was this God and he did this, others didn't, and they did TV programs about why they didn't. What a funny debate that was, you know. So it would be a post-theist society where it wasn't an issue.